The rain hammered against the windows of the Pentagon briefing room as Admiral Robert Hayes adjusted his uniform collar. At 62, he had seen enough classified operations to fill several lifetimes, but today's veteran benefits hearing was supposed to be routine paperwork. Nothing more than approving medical claims and disability compensations for soldiers who had served their country with honor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Hayes reviewed the stack of files before him. Each folder contained the story of a man or woman who had sacrificed something for America. Some had lost limbs, others carried invisible wounds that would never fully heal. The Admiral treated each case with the respect it deserved, knowing that behind every file was a human being who had answered their country's call. When the door opened, a middle-aged man entered the room with a slight limp. James Morrison wore a simple button-down shirt and khaki pants, but his posture still carried the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. His graying hair was cut short, and his weathered hands showed the calluses of someone who had worked hard his entire life. The man's eyes held that particular look Hayes had seen in countless veterans, a mixture of pride and something deeper, something that spoke of experiences most civilians could never understand. Morrison took a seat across from the Admiral's desk without being asked. There was no disrespect in the action, just the confidence of a man who had earned his place at any table. His file indicated 24 years of service, multiple deployments, and a medical discharge following an incident in Afghanistan that had left him with chronic back pain and what the doctors called adjustment difficulties. Admiral Hayes opened Morrison's file and began reading through the standard questions about benefits and medical needs. The veteran answered each inquiry with crisp, professional responses that reminded Hayes of his own early days in the military. Everything seemed perfectly normal until Hayes reached the section about Morrison's final deployment. The paperwork indicated that Morrison had been part of a classified operation in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. The details were heavily redacted, with only basic information about dates and locations visible. Hayes had seen thousands of similar files over the years, but something about this one made him pause. The mission designation was listed simply as Operation Nightfall, and Morrison's unit had been attached to a special reconnaissance team. As Hayes continued reading, he noticed that Morrison had been the only survivor of his squad. The official report stated that an IED explosion had killed 4 other soldiers during a routine patrol, but the details were frustratingly vague. Hayes had learned to read between the lines of military reports, and this one raised more questions than it answered. Morrison sat quietly as the Admiral reviewed his file, his hands folded in his lap. There was a stillness about him that spoke of someone who had learned to wait, to watch, and to keep his thoughts carefully guarded. When Hayes looked up from the paperwork, Morrison's eyes met his with a directness that was both respectful and unwavering. The Admiral decided to ask about the incident that had ended Morrison's career. It was standard procedure to understand the circumstances that had led to a veteran's medical discharge, especially when psychological trauma was involved. Hayes had conducted hundreds of these interviews over the years, and he knew how to approach sensitive topics with the care they deserved. Morrison's expression didn't change when Hayes brought up Operation Nightfall, but something shifted in his eyes. It was subtle, like a shadow passing across water, but the Admiral noticed it immediately. The veteran's hands tightened slightly in his lap, and for a moment, the professional composure slipped just enough to reveal something underneath. The room grew quiet except for the continued drumming of rain against the windows. Hayes found himself studying Morrison's face, looking for clues about what had happened during that final mission in Afghanistan. The file contained the basic facts, but Hayes had learned that the real story often lay in the spaces between the official words. Morrison finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that made Hayes lean forward slightly. The veteran began to describe the mission that had changed everything, starting with their insertion into the remote mountains where intelligence suggested high-value targets were operating. His words were careful and measured, like a man walking through a minefield of memories he had tried hard to bury. As Morrison continued his account, Admiral Hayes noticed that the veteran's breathing had become slightly more controlled, as if he was working to maintain his composure. The story he told matched the official report in its basic details. But Hayes could sense there were layers underneath that Morrison wasn't ready to reveal. The Admiral had interviewed enough combat veterans to recognize the signs of someone carrying a burden that went beyond what appeared in any file. Morrison's case was beginning to feel different from the routine benefits hearing Hayes had expected when he walked into the room that morning. Something had happened during Operation Nightfall that was still haunting this man years later, and Hayes found himself genuinely curious about the truth behind the carefully worded official report. Morrison's voice remained steady as he described the terrain where his unit had been deployed. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan were brutal in winter, with razor-sharp winds that could cut through the best military gear. His squad had been tasked with establishing an observation post to monitor suspected terrorist movements along ancient smuggling routes that had been used for centuries. The veteran explained how his team had consisted of 5 highly trained soldiers, each with specialized skills that made them perfect for long-range reconnaissance missions. There was Sergeant Rodriguez, a communications expert who could maintain contact with headquarters even in the most challenging conditions. Corporal Williams handled explosives and had an uncanny ability to detect improvised bombs before they became deadly. Private First Class Chen was their medic, trained to keep soldiers alive under the worst possible circumstances. Admiral Hayes listened carefully as Morrison described the 5th member of their team. Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson had been their squad leader, a career soldier with over 15 years of experience in special operations. Thompson was the kind of leader who inspired complete confidence in his men, someone who had earned respect through competence rather than rank. Morrison's voice carried a note of admiration when he spoke about Thompson, the respect of one professional soldier for another. The mission had started like dozens of others Morrison had completed during his multiple deployments. They had been inserted by helicopter under cover of darkness, carrying enough supplies for 2 weeks of independent operation. Their orders were to observe and report, avoiding contact with enemy forces unless absolutely necessary. It was the kind of mission that required patience, discipline, and the ability to remain invisible in hostile territory. For the first week, everything had proceeded according to plan. The team had established their observation post in a cave system that provided excellent cover while offering clear views of the valleys below. They had documented vehicle movements, photographed suspected enemy personnel, and transmitted regular reports back to their forward operating base. Morrison described how they had worked in shifts, with 2 men always on watch while the others rested or maintained their equipment. Hayes noticed that Morrison's account became more detailed as he described the daily routine of the mission. The veteran seemed more comfortable talking about the technical aspects of their work, rather than what had ultimately gone wrong. He explained how they had used advanced surveillance equipment to track patterns of movement in the area, building a detailed picture of enemy operations that would be valuable for future missions. The Admiral found himself genuinely interested in the tactical details Morrison was sharing. Hayes had commanded men in combat himself, though his experiences had been different from the close-quarters mountain warfare Morrison was describing. There was something about the veteran's professional competence that reminded Hayes of his own early days as a young officer learning the realities of military service. Morrison continued his story by describing how the weather had begun to deteriorate during their 2nd week in the mountains. A storm system had moved in from the north, bringing heavy snow and winds that made communication with headquarters increasingly difficult. The team had been forced to extend their mission while waiting for conditions to improve enough for extraction. It was during this extended period that Morrison said they had first noticed something unusual about the enemy activity in the area. Instead of the random movements they had been documenting, there seemed to be a pattern emerging that suggested a major operation was being planned. Thompson had made the decision to gather additional intelligence before requesting extraction, a choice that would ultimately change everything. The veteran's voice became slightly more tense as he described how Thompson had ordered the team to move closer to the enemy positions for better surveillance. It was a calculated risk, the kind of decision that experienced special operations soldiers made based on years of training and intuition. Morrison emphasized that Thompson had followed proper procedures and that the team had moved with extreme caution. Admiral Hayes noticed that Morrison was beginning to choose his words more carefully as he approached the events that had ended his military career. The veteran's hands had tightened in his lap again, and Hayes could see the effort it was taking to maintain his professional composure. Whatever had happened next was clearly the heart of why Morrison was sitting in this Pentagon office seeking benefits for service-connected disabilities. The room had grown quiet, except for the veteran's measured voice and the continued sound of rain against the windows. Hayes found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into Morrison's account despite his years of experience with similar stories. There was something about this particular case that felt different, though he couldn't yet identify what was making him pay such close attention. Morrison paused for a moment, seeming to gather himself before continuing with the most difficult part of his story. Hayes waited patiently, recognizing the signs of a man who was about to reveal something he had been carrying alone for far too long. The Admiral had learned that sometimes the most important part of these interviews was simply giving veterans the space they needed to tell their truth in their own way. Morrison took a deep breath before continuing his account of what happened during the final days of Operation Nightfall. He explained how Thompson had divided the team into two groups for the reconnaissance mission that would bring them closer to enemy positions. Morrison and Chen were to establish an observation point on the eastern ridge, while Thompson, Rodriguez, and Williams would position themselves on the western slope to get a better view of a suspected weapons cache. The veteran described the careful planning that had gone into the operation. They had studied topographical maps, identified escape routes, and established communication protocols that would allow both teams to coordinate their movements while maintaining radio silence. Thompson had emphasized that this was purely a surveillance mission and that, under no circumstances should they engage the enemy unless their position was compromised. Admiral, Hayes listened as Morrison detailed the technical aspects of their approach. The two teams had moved out before dawn, using night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous mountain terrain. Morrison and Chen had reached their observation point without incident, settling into a position that provided excellent visibility, while keeping them hidden from anyone moving through the valley below. For several hours, Morrison explained, both teams had maintained their positions while documenting enemy activity. The intelligence they were gathering confirmed that something significant was being planned in the area. Large numbers of weapons were being moved along routes that hadn't seen much activity in previous months, and the enemy personnel appeared to be preparing for a major operation. Morrison's voice became more tense as he described what happened next. Around midday, Chen had spotted movement that seemed different from the routine enemy patrols they had been observing. A group of men in civilian clothes was approaching the area where Thompson's team was positioned, moving with the kind of tactical precision that suggested they were not ordinary smugglers or local fighters. The veteran explained how he and Chen had tried to warn Thompson's team about the approaching threat, but their radio communications were being affected by the mountainous terrain and the weather conditions that continued to deteriorate. Morrison described the frustration of watching potential danger approach his fellow soldiers while being unable to establish clear contact with them. Hayes noticed that Morrison's breathing had become more controlled as he approached the climax of his story. The veteran's professional composure remained intact, but there were subtle signs that he was reliving experiences that had haunted him for years. His hands had remained clasped in his lap, but Hayes could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his jaw had tightened slightly. Morrison continued by describing how the group of armed men had begun systematically searching the area where Thompson's team was concealed. It became clear that this was not a random patrol, but a deliberate effort to locate American forces in the area. Someone had provided intelligence about their presence, and the enemy was conducting a professional manhunt using techniques that suggested military training. The veteran's account of what happened next was delivered in the same measured tone he had maintained throughout the interview, but Hayes could sense the emotional weight behind his words. Morrison explained how he and Chen had watched helplessly as the enemy forces closed in on their teammates' position, knowing that any attempt to provide assistance would likely result in all 5 soldiers being killed or captured. Admiral Hayes found himself completely absorbed in Morrison's story. The tactical situation the veteran was describing represented every soldier's nightmare, being forced to watch fellow troops in mortal danger while being unable to help without making the situation worse. Hayes had been in similar positions during his own combat experience, and he understood the impossible choices that Morrison and Chen had been forced to make. Morrison described how Thompson had made the decision to break radio silence when it became clear that his team's position was about to be overrun. The brief transmission that followed would be the last communication from the Western Observation Post, and Morrison's voice carried the weight of a man who had replayed those final moments countless times in his memory. The veteran explained that Thompson's last message had been brief and professional, reporting contact with enemy forces and requesting immediate extraction for the surviving team members. Morrison emphasized that their squad leader had maintained military discipline even in the final moments, following proper procedures while under fire from a numerically superior enemy force. Hayes noticed that Morrison had paused again, and the Admiral realized they were approaching the moment that had changed everything for this veteran. The rain outside had intensified, creating a drumming sound against the windows that seemed to match the tension building in the small briefing room. Morrison was clearly gathering himself to reveal the most difficult part of his experience, the moment that had ended his military career and brought him to this benefits hearing years later. The Admiral waited patiently, understanding that some stories could not be rushed. He had learned that veterans needed to tell their truth in their own way, and that pushing for details too quickly often caused them to withdraw completely. Morrison was clearly a man who had been carrying a heavy burden, and Hayes was beginning to understand that this interview was about much more than routine benefits processing. Morrison's voice dropped slightly as he described the moments immediately following Thompson's final radio transmission. He and Chen had remained in their observation position, following standard protocol to avoid compromising themselves while hoping for some sign that their teammates had managed to escape the enemy forces. The mountains had fallen silent except for the wind whistling through the rocky peaks. The veteran explained how they had maintained their position for another 6 hours, scanning the area below with their surveillance equipment and listening for any indication that Thompson, Rodriguez, and Williams were still alive. Chen had wanted to move immediately to assist their fellow soldiers, but Morrison had followed Thompson's final orders to maintain their position and wait for extraction. Admiral Hayes noticed that Morrison seemed to be struggling with this part of his account. The veteran's professional composure remained intact, but Hayes could see the internal conflict playing out across his weathered features. The decision to remain hidden while his teammates faced an unknown fate was clearly something that had tormented Morrison for years. As evening approached, Morrison continued. They had received new orders through their satellite communication system. Headquarters had lost contact with Thompson's team and was directing Morrison and Chen to proceed to an emergency extraction point 12 miles away. The message had been clear. They were to avoid any attempt to locate or assist their missing teammates. Morrison described the difficult journey to the extraction point through increasingly hostile terrain. He and Chen had been forced to navigate around enemy patrols that had flooded the area following the engagement with Thompson's team. The veteran's account of their movement was filled with the technical details of military tradecraft, route selection, noise discipline, and the constant awareness that discovery would mean death or capture. The extraction had taken place at dawn the following morning, Morrison explained. A helicopter had picked them up from a remote landing zone, and they had been flown directly to the forward operating base, where they underwent immediate debriefing sessions with intelligence officers. Morrison's voice carried a note of frustration as he described how the debriefing had focused more on the intelligence they had gathered than on the fate of their missing teammates. Hayes listened carefully as Morrison described the official aftermath of Operation Nightfall. Search and rescue teams had been deployed to locate Thompson, Rodriguez, and Williams, but the area had become too heavily contested for extended operations. After 72 hours of searching, the missing soldiers had been classified as killed in action, and their bodies were never recovered. The veteran's account of the memorial services was brief, but emotionally charged. Morrison described standing at attention while his fallen comrades were honored with posthumous decorations for their service and sacrifice. The ceremony had been conducted with full military honors, but Morrison emphasized that the families had been given only limited information about the circumstances surrounding their loved ones' deaths. Admiral Hayes found himself deeply moved by Morrison's description of returning stateside following the completion of his deployment. The veteran explained how he had struggled to readjust to routine military duties after losing his entire squad in Afghanistan. Simple tasks that had once been automatic became difficult, and Morrison found himself constantly reliving the final moments of Operation Nightfall. Morrison's voice became more strained as he described the psychological evaluation that had ultimately led to his medical discharge. Military psychologists had diagnosed him with survivor guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder, conditions that made it impossible for him to continue serving effectively. Morrison emphasized that he had tried to overcome these challenges, but the memories of that final mission had proven too overwhelming. The veteran explained how his attempts to learn more about what had happened to his teammates had been repeatedly blocked by military bureaucracy. Official channels had provided only sanitized versions of events, and Morrison's requests for additional information had been denied based on national security classifications. The lack of closure had made his recovery even more difficult. Hayes noticed that Morrison's hands had begun to tremble slightly as he approached the end of his prepared account. The veteran was clearly struggling to maintain his composure while describing experiences that continued to haunt him years after his discharge from the military. The Admiral recognized the signs of a man who had been carrying an enormous burden of guilt and unanswered questions. Morrison paused for a long moment before speaking again, and Hayes could see that the veteran was preparing to reveal something he had never shared in any official setting. The change in Morrison's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. He was about to cross a line that he had carefully avoided during years of official debriefings and psychological evaluations. The room had grown very quiet, and Admiral Hayes found himself leaning forward slightly in anticipation of what Morrison was about to reveal. The veteran's story had already raised questions about the official version of Operation Nightfall, but Hayes sensed that the most important part was yet to come. Morrison was clearly gathering courage to share information that went beyond what appeared in any file. Morrison looked directly at Admiral Hayes before speaking again, his eyes carrying the weight of a secret he had protected for years. The veteran explained that there was something about Operation Nightfall that had never appeared in any official report, something that had been haunting him since the day he returned from Afghanistan. Hayes could sense that Morrison was about to reveal the real reason for his visit to the Pentagon. The veteran began by describing how his unit had been given a special designation during their final mission. Thompson had received sealed orders that were separate from their standard reconnaissance directives, orders that came directly from a classified source within the Special Operations Command. Morrison explained that their squad had been assigned an additional identifier for this particular mission. They were to be known as Ghost 5. Admiral Hayes felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of that designation. Ghost 5 was not just another military call sign. It was connected to one of the most classified operations in recent military history. Hayes had been briefed on certain aspects of the Ghost program during his early days in naval intelligence, but those briefings had been so highly classified that he had never expected to hear the designation mentioned outside of the most secure facilities. Morrison continued his account, explaining that Thompson had shared the Ghost 5 designation with his team only after they had been inserted into the mountains. The squad leader had explained that their mission was more complex than the standard reconnaissance work they had been told to expect. They were not just gathering intelligence on enemy movements. They were specifically looking for evidence of a high-value target who had been operating in the area. The veteran's voice became more tense as he described how the true nature of their mission had only become clear during their final days in the mountains. The weapons movements they had been documenting were not routine smuggling operations, but part of a larger network that connected directly to international terrorist activities. Ghost 5 had been tasked with gathering evidence that would support a major operation to disrupt this network. Hayes listened with growing concern as Morrison revealed details that went far beyond what should have been shared in a routine benefits hearing. The veteran was describing classified operations that were protected by multiple layers of security protocols. Hayes realized that Morrison's presence in his office was not coincidental. The veteran had specifically sought him out because of his security clearance and his position within the Pentagon hierarchy. Morrison explained that Thompson's final radio transmission had contained more than just a request for extraction. Hidden within the standard military communication procedures, Thompson had transmitted a coded message that contained critical intelligence about the high-value target they had been tracking. Morrison and Chen had been the only witnesses to this transmission, and they had both understood that the information was too sensitive to be shared through normal channels. The veteran described how he had attempted to report Thompson's final message during his initial debriefing sessions, but intelligence officers had told him that no such transmission had been recorded. Morrison had been informed that his memory of events was likely affected by the trauma of losing his teammates, and he had been discouraged from pursuing the matter further. Admiral Hayes found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as Morrison continued his account. The veteran was describing a level of classified activity that went beyond Hayes's current security clearance, but the implications of what he was hearing were impossible to ignore. If Morrison's account was accurate, then there were serious questions about how Operation Nightfall had been handled by the intelligence community. Morrison's voice became more urgent as he explained that he had spent years trying to verify the information Thompson had transmitted in those final moments. The veteran had used his own resources to investigate the high-value target they had been tracking, and what he had discovered had convinced him that Thompson's intelligence had been deliberately suppressed by someone within the military hierarchy. The veteran explained that the target Thompson had identified was still operating in the region years after Operation Nightfall had ended. Morrison had tracked news reports and intelligence summaries that suggested the terrorist network they had discovered was responsible for attacks that could have been prevented if Thompson's final transmission had been properly processed by military intelligence. Hayes realized that Morrison was not just seeking benefits for his service-connected disabilities. He was attempting to expose what he believed was a cover-up of critical intelligence that had cost lives. The veteran's psychological trauma was compounded by his belief that his teammates had died to protect information that had been deliberately ignored or suppressed by officials who should have acted on Thompson's final message. Morrison leaned forward slightly as he prepared to reveal the most sensitive part of his story. He explained that Chen had also attempted to report Thompson's final transmission, but the medic had died in a training accident 6 months after returning from Afghanistan. Morrison believed that Chen's death had not been accidental, and that someone was systematically silencing the witnesses to whatever Thompson had discovered in those mountains. The room had become completely silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. Admiral Hayes found himself staring at Morrison while trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. The veteran was describing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military intelligence, and Hayes was beginning to understand why Morrison had chosen him for this revelation. Admiral Hayes felt his hands begin to shake as Morrison revealed the final piece of information that would change everything. The veteran explained that he had discovered Hayes's name in classified documents he had obtained through unofficial channels. Thompson's final transmission had not been lost. It had been intercepted and classified at the highest levels, requiring approval from flag officers with specific security clearances to access the information. Morrison's voice remained steady as he explained that Admiral Hayes had been one of 3 naval officers who had received briefings about Thompson's final intelligence report. The veteran had spent years tracking down the officials who had been involved in suppressing the information, and Hayes was the only one still in a position to take action on what Thompson had died trying to communicate. The Admiral felt every bit of color drain from his face as the memory came flooding back. 3 years earlier, he had indeed received a classified briefing about intelligence gathered during a failed operation in Afghanistan. The briefing had been so highly classified that Hayes had been required to review the materials in a secure facility and had been prohibited from taking notes or discussing the information with anyone. Hayes remembered the briefing now with crystal clarity. A special operations team designated Ghost 5 had transmitted critical intelligence about a terrorist network operating in eastern Afghanistan. The intelligence had identified a high-value target who was coordinating attacks against American forces throughout the region. The information had been solid, actionable, and time-sensitive. Morrison watched Hayes's reaction carefully before continuing his account. The veteran explained that the high-value target Thompson had identified was not just another terrorist operative. He was an American citizen who had been working as a contractor for the Defense Department while secretly coordinating attacks against U.S. forces. The revelation would have exposed a security breach that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon. Admiral Hayes remembered the decision that had been made following the Ghost 5 briefing. Rather than acting on Thompson's intelligence, senior officials had chosen to classify the information indefinitely while conducting what they described as a more thorough investigation. Hayes had been told that premature action could compromise ongoing operations and potentially expose other intelligence sources. The veteran's voice became more intense as he explained that the decision to suppress Thompson's intelligence had resulted in additional American casualties. The high-value target had continued operating for another 18 months, during which time attacks coordinated by his network had killed or wounded dozens of U.S. personnel, who could have been protected if Thompson's information had been acted upon immediately. Hayes realized that Morrison was right about the cover-up, but the veteran didn't understand the complete picture. The decision to suppress Thompson's intelligence had not been made to protect a traitor. It had been made to protect a larger operation that was already in progress. The American citizen Thompson had identified was actually a double agent who was providing critical intelligence about terrorist operations throughout the region. Morrison continued his account by explaining that he had evidence proving the high-value target was responsible for attacks that occurred after Operation Nightfall ended. The veteran had compiled a detailed timeline showing how Thompson's intelligence could have prevented these attacks if it had been properly processed by military officials. Morrison believed that his teammates had died to expose a traitor, who was subsequently protected by corrupt officials within the Pentagon. Admiral Hayes found himself in an impossible position as he realized the full scope of the misunderstanding that had led to Morrison's psychological trauma. The veteran had spent years believing that his teammates had died for nothing, when in reality Thompson's intelligence had been part of a successful operation that had ultimately dismantled the terrorist network. They had been tracking the Admiral knew that he could not reveal the classified details of the operation that had followed Thompson's final transmission. The double agent Morrison believed was a protected traitor had actually provided intelligence that led to the arrest of over 30 terrorist operatives and prevented multiple large-scale attacks against American targets. Thompson's sacrifice had not been in vain, but Hayes could not explain this to Morrison without violating his oath to protect classified information. Morrison concluded his account by explaining that he had come to Admiral Hayes because he believed the Admiral was his last hope for justice. The veteran wanted Hayes to use his position and security clearance to expose the cover-up that had cost American lives and dishonored the sacrifice of Thompson, Rodriguez, and Williams. Morrison was asking Hayes to risk his own career to ensure that the truth about Ghost 5 would finally be revealed. Hayes looked across the desk at Morrison and saw a man who had been tortured for years by incomplete information and unanswered questions. The veteran deserved to know that his teammates had not died in vain, but Hayes could not provide that comfort without revealing secrets that could endanger ongoing operations and compromise intelligence sources that were still active in the field. The rain continued to beat against the windows as Admiral Hayes struggled with the most difficult decision of his military career. Morrison waited patiently for a response, unaware that his quest for justice was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of events that could never be fully explained. The truth about Ghost 5 would remain classified, leaving Morrison to carry his burden while Hayes carried the knowledge that sometimes protecting national security meant allowing good men to suffer in silence.